Have any of you ever worried about making the right first impression? Is that something that you've thought much about at some point in your life? Maybe you were getting ready to go out on a date with someone, or you were wondering about a job interview and you were going to meet somebody for the first time. And it could have been any of a number of issues that caused you to stop and think about making a good first impression. You may worry about how to do your hair, what clothes to wear, what topics to discuss or to stay away from, especially in this political day and age where the nation seems to be so polarized. You don't want to make the wrong thing to offend the person you're meeting with. So, it isn't hard to get yourself all worked up and wound up and hyper about trying to make a good first impression, if it's something that's really important to you, especially. I remember the first time that I ever met Sue's family. Sue and I were in college down at Moorhead, Kentucky, and Sue was a junior and I was a freshman. Although our birthdays were only 2 weeks apart. I spent 2 years in the Marine Corps before I went to college. So even though we were the same age, she was 2 years ahead of me in school. And we had been dating for a relatively short period of time. I think I swept her off her feet pretty quickly and she decided she wanted to marry me. So we hadn't been dating very long before we decided that we were going to get married. That's my story and I'm sticking with it, okay?
That's another version.
So anyway, we decided we were going to get married, and our families, I had not met her family, nor had she met mine. And this was in October, and so we decided we would go home and visit both families over the Thanksgiving break. And we talked about it between ourselves, and we weren't going to tell either family that we were engaged until we met them. So there would be a little bit less stress on the initial meeting of the parents and the siblings. So we decided that's what we would do. Well, Sue got anxious about it, and she decided she was going to go ahead and tell her family that she was engaged, and she was bringing me home to meet them. Now, I didn't do it. I kept my end of the bargain, okay? So I didn't tell my family, but Sue told hers. So when we got there, she had told them I was an ex-Marine and we were the same age, and that we were going to get married and that we would meet over Thanksgiving. Now, you have to understand, Sue was the second of 6 kids, the first daughter, and the first one to become engaged. Okay, so there's all these different things that are going on in the background. So she was the first to bring a fiancé home for inspection. Now, I really wanted to make a good impression on her family. I did. I'm not completely callous, but the deck was stacked against me, because of the fact that she was the first girl, the first to be engaged. She was still in school. As far as the family was concerned, I was trying to steal their daughter or sister, depending on which part of the family they were. No matter what I did at that first meeting, it was not going to be enough. Okay, it was bad. Well, I got there and they went over me with a fine-tooth comb. They treated me like a horse they were buying to open my mouth and check my teeth. They did everything they could to figure out who I was, and they questioned me. And the first impression that I made with them was not a very good first impression. About the only thing good they could say about me was that Sue liked me, although they really couldn't understand why. That was the start that I had. Or at least that's the way it felt like to me going into that situation. Now, I'm not blaming them for the first impression that I made upon them. They couldn't see inside me to know whether I was some kind of a scoundrel, which I am. And their major concern at the time was to try to do what was best for Sue. And I really didn't have a whole lot going for me at that time. I just spent 2 years in the Marine Corps. I still had 3.5 years of school ahead of me. It was a tough time. So Sue's family did to me what we all do so much of the time. We make our decisions based on first impressions, on outward appearance, on things that we can see feel, taste, or smell, things that we can observe. God, on the other hand, makes God's decisions based on what's on the inside of a person, what is in that person's heart. I want to read to you this morning from the first book of Samuel, the 16th chapter, the first 13 verses. This is the story of Samuel going to Bethlehem to anoint David to be the king, to follow King Saul. The Lord said to Samuel, "How long will you grieve over Saul, seeing I have rejected him from being king over Israel? Fill your horn with oil and go. I will send you to Jesse the Bethlehemite, for I have provided for myself a king among his sons." And Samuel said, "How can I go? If Saul hears it, he will kill me." And the Lord said, "Take a heifer with you and say, I have come to sacrifice to the Lord, and invite Jesse to the sacrifice. And I will show you what you shall do, and you shall anoint for me him whom I name to you." Samuel did what the Lord commanded and came to Bethlehem. The elders of the city came to meet him, trembling, and said, "Do you come peaceably?" And he said, "Peaceably. I have come to sacrifice to the Lord. Consecrate yourselves and come with me to the sacrifice." And he consecrated Jesse and his sons and invited them to the sacrifice. When they came, he looked on Eliab and thought, "Surely the Lord's anointed is before him." But the Lord said to Samuel, "Do not look on his appearance or on the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. For the Lord sees not as man sees. Man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart." Then Jesse called Abinadab and made him pass before Samuel. And he said, "Neither has the Lord chosen this one." Then Jesse made Shammah pass by, and he said, "Neither has the Lord chosen this one." And Jesse made 7 of his sons pass before Samuel. And Samuel said to Jesse, "The Lord has... Are all your sons here?" And he said, "There remains yet the youngest, but behold, he is keeping the sheep." And Samuel said to Jesse, "Send and fetch him, for we will not sit down till he comes here." And he sent and brought him in. Now he was ruddy and had beautiful eyes, and was handsome. And the Lord said, "Arise, anoint him, for this is he." Then Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the midst of his brothers. And the Spirit of the Lord came mightily upon David from that day forward. And Samuel rose up and went to Ramah. May our God add blessing and understanding to our reading of the Word. Today's lesson tells us of the final public act of the prophet Samuel, the judge Samuel. You may remember the story of Samuel. He was born to Hannah and Elkanah later in their lives. He was an answer to Hannah's prayer. She had been barren up until the point that Samuel was born, and she had prayed to God every year. She'd go to the temple and she would pray that she would bear a son. And she promised she would dedicate him to God if she ever were to have a son. So when he was a young boy, about 3 or 4 years old, she took him to the prophet Eli, and she dedicated him to Eli to be raised in the temple to serve God. While he was still a child, God spoke to Samuel and allowed him to know that he would be God's agent, that he would be the judge over the people of Israel. Later in Samuel's life, when the people of Israel were clamoring for a king so they could be like their neighbors, it was Samuel who anointed Saul to become the first king of Israel. At the point in Israel's history where today's reading takes place, Saul had broken God's command. And Samuel has already told Saul that the kingdom is going to be taken away from him and that God was going to give the kingdom to someone else of God's choice. Samuel loved Saul, and Samuel was still grieving for the fact that Saul was going to be ousted from the kingship. And so he didn't want it to happen. He didn't like that it was going to happen. And now God was telling Samuel, "You go to Bethlehem, and anoint a new king, one that will replace Saul. Now, if you've read the story of Jesus' birth, and you hear what King Herod's response was to a new king being born, you know that kings often will take the situation into their own hands if they think there's someone going to usurp their power. King Herod killed all the male children in Bethlehem that were under 2 years old because he didn't want a new king to take over for him. Saul did not want a new king to replace him. He wanted it to be his son Jonathan. So Samuel was worried that even though he had anointed Saul to be king, that Saul might kill him because he was going to take the throne away and give it to someone other than Jonathan. So he was worried about doing that. So he was understandably cautious about going there. So we're informed that God told Samuel to take with him a heifer and offer a sacrifice which would cover his acts of anointing the new king of Israel. That seems just a little bit devious to me if you stop and think about it. God's saying, I want you to go do this, but tell him you're doing this. You know, so that's a different topic. That's something we can talk about some other time maybe. So it sounds deceptive, but that's the way the Bible presents it. When Samuel entered the village of Bethlehem leading the heifer, the elders came out to him and they were trembling with fear. Samuel represented both the power of God and the power of the state. You know, he was an important man in the life of Israel, and the people didn't know whether he came in peace or not. And they were afraid of Saul as well. They didn't want to get caught in the middle between the religious battle and the state battle. That's not a good place to get caught, you know, in between the state and the church. So they were concerned. Samuel told them he'd come in peace to make a sacrifice to God. And then he consecrated the people to attend the sacrifice and to participate in the meal. At the meal, Samuel had Jesse bring his sons before him one at a time because he knew God was going to choose one of them to be the new king of Israel. The first one to come in was Eliab, the eldest, the firstborn of Jesse's 8 sons. He had the look of a king, thought Samuel. Surely the Lord's anointed is before me, he thought. In Israeli tradition, the oldest is always the one who's chosen first. So according to Hebrew tradition, it would stand to reason that Eliab would be the new king, right? Wrong. Have you ever been fooled by first impression or by the looks of someone? Have you ever judged someone by what you see and what's really the case is different? One of the worst presidents in the United States history became president largely because of his appearance. He looked presidential. He was tall and he was stately and he had a bearing that people could look at and recognize that he was a leader. He looked presidential. So in 1920, the Republicans who couldn't decide who to nominate for president, so they agreed upon this person who looked presidential as a compromise president or a compromise candidate. So they nominated Warren G. Harding, who from just up the road at Marion, Ohio. That's where I was born and raised. Been to the Harding Mansion and Harding Home, the museum there. And Harding won the election. And he has the distinction of having one of the most scandal-ridden administrations in the history of our country. Okay? And he got elected because he looked presidential. Okay? You know, that was the impression he gave. Even though Samuel thought that Eliab would be the next king, God said no. God said, do not look on his appearance or on his stature, because I have rejected him. For the Lord sees not as man sees. Man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart. And so it went through all 7 of the sons that Jesse had brought to the feast. He checked out all 7 of them in order. None of them were the ones that God said, this is the next king. And finally, in frustration, Samuel asked if there were any others. And Jesse's response was, well, only the youngest, but he's out watching the sheep. You know, He's there so we can be here, so the important ones in the family can come. And Samuel said, well, we're not going to start until I see him too. So Jesse sent and had someone bring David in. And David hadn't been consecrated. He hadn't cleaned himself up. He wasn't dressed for the feast. He was out watching the sheep. I don't know if any of you have been around sheep much, but they do have a certain odor about them. And so it maybe isn't conducive to being able to sit down at a banquet meal with people if you haven't really changed your clothes and scrubbed up for it. So he brought him in. And yet, even though it went against Israel's customs and traditions, it was the youngest, it was the least, it was the last of the family that God chose. Now, I don't believe that God chose David because he had a ruddy complexion or because of his beautiful eyes or because he was handsome. We've already been told God looks on the inside, not on the outside. God sees what others cannot see. God sees the heart. And he saw in David the person that he would name to be the king. And so I believe God chose David not because of any of the things that David was. God's choice of David was a free and gracious act. God chose him to demonstrate God's power in weakness. God reversed the expectations of the world. God made the first last and the last first. David didn't deserve the honor of being king, but God chose him anyway. And God still chooses whomever God wills to be his servants and his messengers today. God still sees, not as we humans see, but God sees the inside, that which is most important. You think about it for just a moment. What's your image of a pastor? Most of us have a fairly good image in our mind of what a pastor looks like, or what a pastor sounds like, or what a pastor is. And think about the image you have in your mind of a pastor, and then ask, does your image include ethnic minority persons? Does your image include someone who is young as well as someone who may be older? Does your image include females as well as males? God will choose, and God chooses those whom God wishes, that God wants, not necessarily those whom we might choose. It's God's choice and God's call. God exceeds and often reverses our expectations. God shows God's power in unexpected ways and in unexpected places. The very fact that I'm here before you this morning is evidence that God calls whom he wills, because I had no idea, no desire, no wish ever to be a pastor. I did not think I would ever be able to stand in front of a congregation and read the scripture and pray, try to preach. That was never anything in my farthest realm of possibility. And yet God still chose. And those whom God chooses, God gives to do the work that God has chosen them to do. Okay? That's the important thing. God chooses, and then God gives. But it's not just for those who are pastors that God chooses, regardless of our imperfections. It isn't those that are just set apart for ordained ministry that I'm talking about. God chooses each and every one of us in the church to be involved in ministry that God has set apart for us to do. God calls us to minister, and it's up to us then to respond to the love and acceptance, and to accept the forgiveness that God gives, and to live our lives in response to God's word. God has called each and every one seated here today to do something for God's kingdom. The question is, are we doing it? Are we doing what God would have us to do? So I ask, have you responded to God's call in your life? Have you accepted the love and forgiveness that God offers to you? Do you really know and accept that God sees what is most important, that which is on the inside, in you as well as in others? And how have you responded to God's call in your life? May each of us do as David did and respond to God's call today and every day. Amen.